welcome to week 3 of legal research, and this week we're looking at problem analysis, which is a crucial part of the early stage of planning that unfortunately a lot of people don't spend enough time on, and sometimes we end up as academics in the unfortunate position of having to mark work where students go off on a tangent, they go off in the wrong direction, or they don't really answer the problem that's set in front of them. So it's important in all projects, but it's particularly important in big projects because those small changes you make at the beginning of a project can have a huge effect later on. So we look at how you look at the initial problem that's before you, the actual research task, and how you weave that into a final paper. And we're focusing on the idea of debate and the idea of being able to establish that there are different voices within the debate. Remember, in the last 2 weeks we've been looking at different positions and different voices, and this time around we're looking at how those get woven together into the structure of a paper. So this week is really about writing, and that may seem slightly counterintuitive given I just said we're doing the planning stage. And the problem with that is we often tend to think of writing as something that happens at the end of a project, rather than writing being something that happens all the way through and something that you start at the very beginning. So we'll get back to the topic of the workshop in a little bit. First, it's just a quick discussion of some of the materials that are also in the study guide for this week. The readings, for instance. There are 2 readings. The first, the one on sources, what is the law itself, is really there as for means of revision. These are things you've done before, these are things you did in first year, but they may be a long way away now, particularly if you're part-time, and it's worth revising and thinking about what the different sources of knowledge and information that are used in law. Legal education is, because of the time in which it was created and the way the Priestley 11 were created, and things that are outside our control, is very much skewed towards an old way of thinking about law. It's about thinking about cases and about thinking about appeal courts. And the law really hasn't focused on case law for quite some time. And it's one of the ironies of being a law student is you spend a lot of your time working with something that is not actually something you're going to be working with in practice. Now, I'm not diminishing that. It is really important you know how the law works and how appeals work. It's just the fact of the matter is most of you will not be working on appeal cases. It's just the way the profession works. So it's also important to think about all the other things that are important, and those are things from other disciplines as well. So an understanding of data and evidence and theory that comes from other sources is very important. So that's why that reading's in there, to give you time to sort of revise and to think about those things and to put those into context. That even though you spend all too many hours of your time looking at cases and what judges said in appeal cases, there's a whole world of other legal sources out there. And certainly if you were studying the law, say in the United States, the focus is way more on legislation, because that's where the game is in terms of law. That's where things actually occur, not so much in case law, and that's been the case for a very long time. But we are limited to a structure that is still based on the perception of what the law was back when the Priestley 11 came about. Anyway, so that does feed into the second reading, which is thinking about IRAC. Now, it's a fairly long reading, and I don't expect you to have an encyclopedic knowledge of this one, but it's also worth having even a skim through it and having a look at what some different people say about case method and what you do to understand cases, because IRAC again is a reasonably blunt instrument, and it's very much designed as trainer wheels for first year students to get them up and running. Say, well, how can I summarise a case? Well, here's a nice simple approach to it. But that can be very limiting later on, and some people get very wedded to IRAC and have to be sort of forcibly weaned off of it later on, because it is very simplistic and you need to know a lot more about cases. And we'll be coming up in a few weeks' time, we're going to have another look at cases as legal sources, as research sources. We're going to dig back into the sort of thing that you need to do. But for the moment, what I want to start doing is displacing some of that ideas that that anyone in the legal profession does IRACs or something like that, and that there are limitations to that. All right. So this is about the transition from those learner plates that you get in first year to what you do as a professional. All right, in the navigating the law section this week, we look at textbooks and encyclopedias and the sources that are aggregating sources that take all the knowledge in a field and put it all together. And electronic technology has changed this world quite a lot. Back in the day, when I studied before there was an internet, it was a matter of trying to find the most recent version of a textbook, which may be 5, 6, 7 years old, and then you'd have to fill in what had happened in between in developments in the law. Now, that's still the case with textbooks, really. They come out more regularly, just so, to stop students selling them second hand, I think. So that you get more recent versions of textbooks, but you still have that gap. And if it was a real legal situation, you couldn't afford just to say, well, last year is good enough, because there could have been all sorts of things happen in the last 12 months. And let's face it, it takes a long while for a textbook to get from the finished version to print. So there's things that happen in that time as well. So that's where legal encyclopedias come into play. And legal encyclopedias are something that I really encourage you to learn how to use. And we'll provide some tips a little later on around using it, but there is no substitute for actually getting in and playing around with them and using them. So, I'll show them in class and show you ways of using them, but they are quite awkward to use. Their interface is kind of strange, particularly if you're used to just Googling everything, and the way they present information is very, very specific. So, as I said, it's a sort of thing that in the time we have available, I can give you some pointers to get started, but you really need to immerse yourself and put aside some time to work with them and honestly deal with the frustration of legal encyclopedias, because it's not going to be a nice simple thing like Googling what cases have considered negligent advice in the last 12 months. You're going to get sort of a very kind of raw set of information out of those encyclopedias. So I'm not saying that to be off-putting. I'm not saying that to discourage you from getting to use them. Rather, I'm trying to encourage you to do that. So if you do that while you're a student, while you have people like myself who you can ask questions of and use them, that means that when you get in practice or whatever career you end up in and people expect that you're going to be able to do that, you're going to be able to do it rather than suddenly realise this is a core legal skill you don't have. So again, legal encyclopedias, put a pin in it, we'll come back to it, but you need to make time to sit down with the Laws of Australia or Halsbury's Laws of Australia and actually to find a topic, probably from one of your research projects, from one of the subjects you're studying, and actually use it to find out what information is on that area, and understand the ways in which those encyclopedias present information, because it's not designed for everyday readership. It's not Wikipedia. It's not designed for anyone to pick up and go, oh, okay, what's the latest developments? It's written in a very kind of dense, segmented information style. Okay, so that's legal encyclopedias. Hopefully you've had a look at them already, and you had a look at them in first year, but if you've done that, you may have forgotten about them. And if you have done, it's a good time to improve those skills in the area. All right, what's next? So before we jump into the research, the workshop topic itself for this week, I want to come back to that idea of research and writing, because that's very core to what we're doing this week. What we're doing this week is we're moving towards the plan, which is due in a couple of weeks' time, so it's coming up very quickly. And what you'll be doing is trying to provide a structure for where you're going forward, and we'll be using the mind mapping process again to set out in a visual way that idea of the different elements of your research and the sequence. And I like to talk about the backbone of a project and being able to find that thread that runs all the way through each of those nodes in sequence in the research itself. So you don't just have, and I do see these all the time, a paper that starts off in a topic, then jumps to another topic, and jumps to another topic, and jumps to another one, and then jumps back, and then at some point says, I'm out of space now, that's it. That's the end. What you want is this clear idea from the beginning that you're saying, okay, there are 3 elements that we need to discuss. I'll discuss each of those in detail. Element 1 has 2 different options. Option A, option B, explore them, compare, contrast, come to a conclusion. There's a reasonably, I think, straightforward example of this in the Legal Research Primer, which is on Moodle and on Teams, and that's the template, the research template I developed to show first years how to do a research project. I think it's still just as valid for you guys as well. I think it's just as useful. So have a look at that before you go into this workshop, and have a look at that structure of how to move through the phases of the paper to give you an idea of what you'll need to do. Now, you haven't done the research yet, so a lot of the things won't be statements, they'll be questions. So it won't be a question of area A, there are 2 different opinions. It'll be area A, what are the different opinions? We know there's this interpretation, there's that interpretation, but where am I going to be able to find out more? So always think about these early stages of your research in terms of the questions you're asking yourself, and being able to identify those zones, those areas where you're going to need to do more research. And that means when you actually come out to plan your time for doing the research, you are focusing on your needs and what you need to find, and you're not spending all your time looking at things you've already got and saying, well, I've got 3 sources that say this, and I've just found another 7 sources that back that up. But I've got an area over here where I really don't have any sources at all. Be able to be very strategic and targeted with the way in which you spend your time, because time is finite and time is precious, and spend it where you need to be able to spend it. And what all this focus and structure also does is get you into the rhythms of writing from the very beginning, and is one of those myths that people think about when they talk about research often, that there's a research phase where you go off and you find things, and then you come and bring them all back together and you write it all up. And that sort of might work in some of the sciences. I mean, I can't really speak for them, where maybe you go off to the lab and you pour all the chemicals together and you write down what all the chemicals do together, and you come back and then you write up all those results. But it doesn't work in the other areas of research, particularly the humanities or legal research, where you need to be conscious of building that structure all the way through. This is why I talk about the backbone, and being able to, you start with the spine. You start with the spine where your argument, and remember that your thesis, your research argument is more than just the question you're asked. It becomes a statement. My statement is not. The question is option A or B better? You know, do committals belong in the magistrate's court, or do they belong in the Supreme Court? That's a question. What your backbone of your paper will be: committals belong in the Supreme Court for these reasons, and here are the different opinions of both sides of the story. Here's the debate. Here's the evidence on both sides, and this is what I'm saying. So you move along the way, and sometimes it takes you a while to get to that definite point of that thesis, but you move towards making a definite statement, and that means that your paper has a purpose, and you don't get to the end of it and go, well, I suppose it depends on what you think. Some people think this, some people think that. That's a weak paper, and if you want to do well, you have to have a strong paper. So you have a strong opinion, but it's an opinion that's also backed up with the evidence and the research that's there. It's not just you being a person on the internet who has a strong opinion and a loud voice. That's not what research is about. All right, and it's also about how you deal with, and we'll talk about this a little later, how you deal with contrary ideas. This is very important as well, because sometimes if you think my argument is that the magistrates' courts, that the Supreme Court is the right place to have committals done, all right, we go with their plan. And you've got a really good, strong argument, though, that also is in favour of the magistrates' courts. The temptation may be, if you don't really think about it, to go, well, I won't raise the other piece of evidence because it weakens my argument. But in reality, it's really, really good to introduce contrary pieces of evidence and then to deal with them. That's your high distinction level work, if you pull that off, where you're actually bringing in all the different points of view, including the ones that are strong arguments against what you are saying, but you are able to say, this is the counter argument, and I don't agree with it for these reasons, backed up by this evidence. So all this shuffling and moving things around occurs as you go in the research project. And what you're doing now is laying out a foundation plan for where you go. And I say this quite a lot, that your actual argument, your central thesis, should be something you should be able to write on a post-it note. And the thing about post-it notes is you can screw them up and throw them away and write a new one. And that happens all the way through research, because you'll have a strong opinion as you start, and that opinion will be modified. It may not change completely, but it'll be modified as you go. And that's when you say, okay, I want to reword that and I want to change that around. All right. So this is about being organised and structured in the way in which you present your research. It's about, I mean, and one of the worst ways to present your research is the shotgun approach, where you just put everything in there and hope that something hits. That's not what we're doing. We're being very targeted. We're being very strategic in the way in which we do it. And getting back to the theme of writing, this strongly informs your writing. When you come to write up a project, if you write it up at the end, you're setting yourself a very almost an impossible task, because you're working with a haphazard structure that has not been written as you go. Whereas if you think about writing everything as you go, even though you're revising it, even though you're changing it, even though you're putting in dummy sentences that you know are ugly, that don't work, that you're going to change later on to something that reads nicely, if you're focusing on that task of writing all the way through, your whole paper makes sense. So we'll return to that theme, but I'm promote that quite often throughout the course, because students will often say, what could I do better, when they're seeking feedback for assignments. And the sad thing is that it's two things. One is you can do more research, you can actually do more work at the front end, and often you might think you've done a lot of work, but there is much more work that needs to be done. So that's one part of it. But often the thing particularly that makes the difference between a distinction and a high distinction piece is the writing. And writing is something that is quite difficult to teach in a sort of a classroom format. I mean, we can do the things where you write sentences and rewrite them and whatever, sort of the high school thing. You probably don't even do that at high school anymore. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. Writing is really about your mastery of language, and the best advice I've ever heard about becoming a better writer is to read more. It's just to immerse yourself in reading and to immerse yourself in different genres. So yes, do more reading of legal articles, more reading of legislation, more reading of cases. That goes without saying. It's the process of reading is not just about extracting summaries and information. It's about finding out, looking at the style and looking at the way, the technique of the writing, and learning from that. And not just learning from good examples, learning from bad examples. And often bad examples can be more instructive than good examples, because a really well done piece of writing is often seamless and it's very hard to see what they've done there. But a bad piece of writing, you can often see it straight away and go, oh, okay, I know what's wrong with that, or I know how I could do that better. So read critically, read actively, don't read passively, and read widely. Read law, read other disciplines, read newspaper articles, read fiction, read poetry, read IKEA instructions. Just expose yourself to the whole world of communication, and do that in a way where you're critically thinking about it all the time, saying, well, look at a news article. Well, how did they present that point of view? How did they introduce those facts? How did they support that? How did they make that argument? And every time you do that, you're becoming a better writer yourself. So we'll be doing more focus on presentation and communication down the track in the end of this course. So at this point, we're not polishing our sentences. We're not presenting beautifully written exposition or beautifully written pieces of evidence. And a lot of what we do at the early stages of research is putting in stuff to fill space that we know we're going to rewrite later. And as we're writing it out, we go, oh, this is really ugly, this is really clunky. But you know that later on you're going to be able to come back and express that in a way which is much more clean. Much more clean. We're talking about bad writing here, bad expression. That is much cleaner and easier to read and more persuasive than the rest of it. But you are doing this in a conscious way. You're not just bodging everything together and then sending it off. You're doing this knowing that you're shaping something. All right. I have talked an awful lot on this topic, I'm sure. So we're going to come back to this. It will probably make a little more sense with the worked example in the workshop this week. And I'll start looking at the way in which you start assembling those key structures at the foundation of a research and writing project that will build later on. And as I said somewhere in the last 10 minutes or so, if you haven't done so already, have a look at the primer and have a look at the research paper template at the back, and hopefully that will help you out.